Remember that end sequence of Interstellar? We're kind of doing something like that. Let's add a whole new dimension.
Perfect.
Here we are, back in space. But we're actually going to be leaving space because we've been staring at this thing for a while, and to talk about the next part of what we're getting into, we're going to move over to creating a new scene instead to make it a little bit more clear. But just to sort of establish what the problem is, we have our scene here. We have a spaceship, we have some planets, we have a background. But it's all on just a flat 2D plane. What if we wanted to zoom in on the alien? Maybe we want to see his facial expression a little bit more, or we want to zoom in on the satellite in the background. How would we actually do that? Take our spaceship and we could just scale that up. That's really only scaling the spaceship and not everything around it. So you could take all of the layers and parent them to the spaceship, or just to make it a little bit more clear, we'll create a null object, parent all the layers to the null object instead, and we'll go ahead and scale that one up. Yes, we're scaling everything up, but we're not really getting any sensation of depth in the scene. There's no parallax, or there's no separation of objects in the foreground versus objects in the background, which is what would happen in the real world. And that's the issue that we want to tackle here. We'll just name this one Scene Forest, and we'll do 1920 by 1080, 60 frames per second, 10 seconds long, and we'll click OK. And just like before, we will have our scene here, but we'll design our assets in separate compositions. So before I do anything else, I'm going to create a composition, new composition, and this one is going to go called Tree. And again, because we're working with an asset now, we want to make it larger. So we'll do the standard 3000 by 3000, 60 frames per second. And as a general rule of thumb, if my scene length is going to be 10 seconds, I like to make sure that all of my assets are at least twice, maybe even 3 times as long. So I'm going to put 30 on the clock here. And that is because that will give me a little bit more flexibility when I put all of these objects into my scene and I want to move them around on the timeline. This will not be the most beautiful, most impressive tree design of all time. I'm going to stick to something very simple. So I'm going to use the rounded rectangle tool. We'll just go ahead and scale you down, turn up the roundness, and make it a greenish color since it's going to be the crown of the tree. I'll then go ahead and move that up a little bit. And we'll just name that Tree Crown. I'll then use my pen tool and just create a point down here and a point up here. And in this case, I'm not looking for a fill, but I want to have a brownish stroke like so. No fill, thank you. Change the line cap from butt cap to round cap and get a rounded corner up here. Point here, point there, slightly shorter point over there. And we'll just go ahead and say, this is our tree that we're super happy with. We love the way it looks, and we'll go ahead and put that into our scene. In our scene, we'll take the tree composition, drag it in. And again, on purpose, this is way too large since it is 3000 by 3000. But we'll just go ahead and scale it down to 25 or 20. And we'll have one in the middle, duplicate that, move that over to the right. Duplicate again, move that over to the left, and then I'll go ahead and create a ground plane. So I'll go up here and just use a rounded rectangle. I'll make it pretty wide, so it's way wider than my viewer is. And I don't need the outline, so I'll get rid of that. But I want to have a fill that might as well be the same fill color as the trees themselves. And let's just go ahead and name that ground, and I'll put that below our layers. Now, we want to create some depth in this scene, and there's a couple of different variations of doing that. If you're a 2D artist that's just focusing on working in the 2D medium, you have a couple of different tools at your disposal. So if you want to have a ground plane and trees further in the background, what we would do is duplicate the ground, move that up like this, maybe make the color a little bit lighter, and then we'll take a tree, we'll duplicate that and put that below the ground planes. So it's sitting over here. And then go ahead and scale that down, duplicate it, and put that tree over there. And while technically this visually does sort of look like the trees and the ground plane are further in the distance, further away from the camera, it's not actually the way that it's built. We've just changed the color and scaled things down. To really get the most out of working in After Effects and giving your scenes actual depth, what we like to do is work in what is typically referred to as 2.5D. So it's not 2D, it's also not really fully 3D, it's somewhere in the middle, and that's what we're calling the 2.5D. So to get into 2.5D, or to get into the 3D workspace, I'm going to go ahead and select all of my layers. And down here in the timeline, I have a little tiny cube that's called 3D layer, allows this layer to be manipulated in 3 dimensions. Yes, please. I'll just go ahead and click that icon. And what's happening here is you'll see we now have these typical 3D gizmos on all of our layers. So if you've ever used Cinema 4D or Maya or 3ds Max or any other real 3D program, we typically have this little gizmo that allows us to control the X, Y, and the Z position. And the Z is really the secret sauce here. That is what's going to be giving us the depth that we're looking for. So instead of having my layers here scaled down to make it look like they're further back, what if we could just move them further back in 3D space? That is exactly what we want to do now. So I'm going to get rid of those to just make sure that all of my trees are going to be the same scale. I'm going to duplicate one of them again and just move it on the X and the Y and position it somewhere over here. Duplicate it again, move it somewhere over there. Duplicate it again, over there, and over there. So we have a row of 4 in the background. I'm then going to take my trees here and parent them to ground 2, which is the light green one, the one that's going to be further back in 3D space. And now I can move that back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the position by hitting P on my keyboard. And I now have X, Y, and a third one, which is going to be the Z position. It's currently set to 0. If I just move that number, you'll see that it sort of looks like I'm moving this thing further back or closer to us, or kind of looks like I'm scaling it down. But really what I'm doing is I'm moving it in 3D space. And the way that we can make this even more clear is by going over here to the comp viewer. Down here it says active camera, but we can click on this and get different options for the view that we're looking at. And there are 3 pretty handy custom views here that come by default in After Effects. So I'm going to go ahead and change it to custom view 1. And now you'll see when I change the Z position to be a higher number, it's moving further and further away. When I change it to be a lower number, so less than 0, when I move into the negative numbers, it's actually moving closer to where our eyes would be. So I want to move this pretty far back. Let's just go ahead and say 700. And again, our trees are parented to this ground plane. They don't have to be, but I did it that way to easily be able to move everything at once. I can now hop back to my active camera. To get even more control out of the scene, what we want to have is a camera. Right now we're just looking at it from the default view, but we want to have a camera that we can control. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and do Layer, New, Camera. For the type, I'm going to pick a 2-node camera. What that means is going to become clear in just a second. As far as the preset goes, if you've ever done any live action video or photography, you know that a 50mm lens is pretty much what we would say is what the human eye sees. So that's kind of the default lens, and that's the one that we'll stick to for now as well. So all of the other settings you don't need to care about, they will be changed by default when you're picking a different preset, but we'll go ahead and pick the 50mm preset and just click OK. Now, with our camera created and all of our layers being 3D, what we're doing now is we're actually looking through this camera. Our view hasn't changed, but we're now able to control our view. We can do that by opening up the settings over here. We have the transform options, which is going to be fairly similar to things you've seen before. We have the position, we have X, Y, and Z rotation, but we also have something called point of interest up here. So if I just start off with the position and I move the X value left and right, you'll see the camera sort of pivots around a specific point from left to right. You can also do the same thing up and down. And I can change the rotation, and that's going to be rotating our view like so. And I can change the point of interest, which is going to be the point that the camera is looking. Just to show you this even more clearly, let's hop back to custom view 1. And now you'll see we're looking at the scene that we had before, but now we also see our camera down here, and we see the cone of view and what the camera is seeing. So when I change the position value on X from left to right, you'll see what we saw before. The camera is moving from left to right, but the point of interest, which is where the camera is looking and where the camera is focusing, is set right in the middle of that centered tree. If I instead change the point of interest, I can change where the camera is looking, and if I change the rotation, you'll see that the whole camera is rotating like so. And this way of working is fine. It works, but it's not really the way that I prefer to work. What I like to do is, instead of controlling my camera, I like to create a separate layer to control the camera, and that gives me a little bit more control and makes the camera behave more in a way that I would anticipate it to work. And for that, we're using our good old friend, the null layer. So we'll create a new null object, and we'll turn that 3D. And again, because our tree was created at the center point of the composition, that's also where our null is going to be placed. So I'm just going to go ahead and rename that layer to be camera control. And I'll take my camera and I'll parent my camera to the 3D null. Now I can close up the camera controls and instead open up the null controls. The null is going to be behaving like any other 3D layer, but now I have my camera parented to the null, so wherever the null goes, the camera follows. This makes the camera behave a little bit more like I would expect it to. So when I change position, the camera is not going to be changing its positioning and pivoting around the point of interest like it did before. When I change position left and right, you'll see the null moves, the camera moves, so everything is moving left to right as if the camera was on a dolly track. I can also move it up and down or in and out with the Z position. At this point, if I want the camera to actually rotate, I would use rotation, as it's now going to be rotating around that null, and that just makes a little bit more sense to how things would work. So if I rotate the X, the camera is rotating around it, up and down or left and right. And this way of working, again, is just a little bit easier. Preference-wise, completely up to you, but I would recommend always creating a 3D null, parenting your camera to that null, and animating the null instead. Let's hop back to our active camera, and that's now going to say active camera, camera 1, which is the name of our layer over here. And now, when I control my null and I move it on the C position, the camera is moving closer or further away, or I can rotate. And now you can clearly see that I'm getting that separation of the foreground, which is this first layer, and the background, which is that second layer. And this gives the scene a little bit more depth. Now, what we can see is that the trees on the first ground plane are placed exactly on that ground plane, and same thing for the background. So we can be a little bit more creative and a little bit more diverse in how we plant our trees. And again, we can hop back to custom view 1, and I can just go ahead and select my different layers, and I can pull the C position closer and closer, and a little bit closer on that one, close on that one. I don't want to pull them back necessarily because I don't want it to be behind my ground layer. So I'm sort of thinking of this as the ground plane being the very furthest back of this layer of trees, and then I can place whatever I want between here. So I can duplicate it again, place it closer to the first row of trees in the first ground plane like so. And I can just keep duplicating it and moving it around like this. I could then go ahead and duplicate ground to have ground 3, and let's just do that double. So instead of 700, we'll do 1400. And I'll again make that a little bit lighter. Duplicate a tree, place them in the middle, move that back, and keep duplicating some trees to start to populate my park or my forest. Trees here that are associated with the ground plane at the very back, I can just select all of those layers and make them cyan, for example. I can select all of these layers, make them a different color, just to clean up my timeline a little bit and have things make sense. And I'll just select my camera null and camera and make those yellow. So now everything is nice and clean and everything makes sense down here. If I want to do some sort of a change on all of my trees in the very back, I could take one of them and maybe I want to add a curves or a levels effect or something to tweak the colors a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and pick a curves effect. Just double click that and just make it slightly lighter like this, as if it's fading into the haze of the background. I can then just take that curves effect and select all of my layers back here, just hit paste. And now we're getting a bit more of a visual separation as well. So we're separating things in 3D space, building things in 2.5D, but with a simple minimalistic visual style like this, they can bleed together a little bit, and it might be a good trick to also add some of these effects. So if I want to do the same thing on the middle field, I can take one of the curves effects, just paste that on one of the trees, and let's just eyeball it and make it sort of half as bright, or maybe even less, just a little bit like this. Again, we'll go ahead and copy that and paste it on all the trees on this level in 3D space. Just jump back to custom view 1 and we'll see level 1 closest to the camera, no effect to the colors with curves. Level 2 slightly brighter, level 3 even brighter, and now we're getting a visual separation of those trees as well. We're working in a simple 2D but 2.5D type style here, but we can still introduce things that you would find in the real world as well. Like we used a 50mm camera, we can introduce something called depth of field as well. Depth of field is the effect that happens when one object is in focus, objects in the background and in the foreground will be out of focus. How much they are out of focus will depend on the lens and your camera settings. So what I'll do is I'll take one of my trees and I'll duplicate it, and I'll just make that layer red instead. Now I will move it to negative numbers and move it closer to the camera so it's fairly close like this. I'll duplicate that again and just put one over on the right side as well. And I'll just do one small tweak to the color of the grass here in the front, so we have a little bit of separation like this. So to animate the camera, we're animating the 3D null. But to do depth of field, we want to dive into the camera itself. So we'll open that up, we'll close the transform settings, and we'll just open up the camera options. And here we have a bunch of things, but the one that we're interested in is called depth of field, which is currently set to off. So we're just going to head and turn that on. Now, you're probably not seeing a difference, and that is because we don't have a high enough blur level. So I'm going to turn up the blur level quite a bit. Let's just go to 300. We'll also turn up the aperture, and you'll start to see the trees in the foreground are starting to go out of focus, but so is kind of everything else. It's very noticeable here, but even the things in the background, nothing is really quite in focus. And the reason why that is happening is because of our focus distance. So I can just randomly play around with the numbers and try to see what happens. And I can see some things are changing when I turn it up or down. Oh, and here we go. Looks like the foreground trees are kind of in focus. It's a little bit hard to place exactly where that focus plane actually is. Again, this is when we can dive into the custom views, and we can select custom view 1, which might help us, but it can be a little bit confusing depending on how much you have going on in your scene. What I like to use to get the depth of field right is actually the top view. So I'll select the top view instead. Just by zooming out, you'll see we have our camera over here, and all of these colored lines correspond to our layers. So right here, we have 2 red lines. That's going to be our 2 red layers, which are closest to the camera. Then we have our purple set of layers with our ground plane, the very wide one, and then we have our trees, trees, trees. So by selecting the camera, I can see my camera over here and my cone of view with the point of interest, which is now my 3D null over here. But I also have a line here, and that's my focus distance. So I can pull that further away or closer to the camera. And again, that is going to be changing what is in focus. Now, it can be a lot of hopping back and forth between the top view and the active camera and the custom view. And that's why you can select the 1 view down here. Let's change that to 2 views instead. And now we can look at our active camera over here. And in this view, we can change that to be the top view, for example. That means that on the left-hand side, I can look at the final result. And on the right side, I'm able to see a top view of my scene, which will help me place my focus distance. So I'm going to go ahead and set that to roughly where our foreground trees are, like so. Now you can see that everything else in the background is very much out of focus, and these trees in the foreground are in focus. If I want to tweak how much or how little things are out of focus, I can play around with the blur level and the aperture. And again, this will be mainly probably a stylistic choice. If you think that depth of field works with the visual style that you're working with, by all means, go ahead. If you want to stick to a more flat 2D type look, then maybe depth of field doesn't really fit into the style that you're working with. And we're just going to have a look at this scene as a whole. If we wanted to add a little bit more life to the scene, how would we go about doing that? Well, the nice thing about working this way, where you're designing your asset in a separate composition and you're pulling those assets together to one final scene, again, very similar to the way that you would work in live action or stop motion, where props are made, actors are off in their trailers doing things. Everybody shows up on set, you hit record on the camera, and then you have your scene. All of that stuff is already in a 3D space because it's happening in the real world. But in After Effects, we're mostly working 2D, and that's why we need to build that entire 3D scene like we just did. The big benefit of having built everything like this, and why I almost exclusively make every single layer in my scene always be 3D and always work with a camera, is because it gives you many shortcuts to add very little time and effort to something like a camera animation, but gives the scene much more life that way. So what we can do just to showcase this is, for the camera control, I'm going to go ahead and click P on the keyboard, set a keyframe at 0, and then go to, let's say, 3 seconds, set a keyframe. So this is where I want my camera to end up at the end. I'll just go back to the beginning, and now I can just move the Y position up. So we're starting off in the sky like this, and I can just go ahead and say easy ease on my keyframe, go into the graph editor, just turn up that easing quite a bit. Now I have sort of an establishing shot where the camera is coming down from the sky and easing into the position here with trees scattered all over 3D space, which gives the scene much more depth like this and gives me a sense of a feeling that the scene is actually alive. When doing movements like this, what I like to do is I do my main camera animation on the position, and then I use anchor point on the same layer as sort of a backup for secondary motion. That can be a little bit abstract to understand, but just to show you what I mean, I have my main camera movement happening here during the first 3 seconds. Camera goes from up in the sky down to here. And then from here, or throughout the entire scene, maybe I just want to have a little bit of a slow camera zooming in or zooming out or moving left and right. Instead of messing around with my keyframes on position that I've already placed, I can instead use anchor point. So I'm going to hit Shift A to bring up the anchor point. I'm going to set a keyframe. I'm going to go to the very end. For the anchor point, I'm just going to turn up that number, or turn it lower actually, to zoom in or to move closer. And let's think of it as if this tree is the main focus area that we want to focus on. So we're pulling closer to that tree, with the trees in the foreground being there in the beginning, but then we're moving past those trees. And again, simple camera move, only 4 keyframes in total, but we're getting much more of a feeling of this scene being an actual scene in the real world, even though we're working in a simplistic animated style.
We did 3D stuff. Sort of. We did 2.5D, but if you want to learn about the real 3D stuff, then click the link to the next video, because we're talking all about 3D in that one, and click the like, click the subscribe, hang out, and learn a bunch of cool stuff here.
Perfect.